At the moment a naval blockade becomes more than a headline, the ocean stops behaving like open space and starts behaving like a border. Not a border you can see on a map, but a border you feel in routing decisions, insurance premiums, and captains being told to turn their ships around before sunrise. BBC's latest headline says an Iranian commander is threatening shipping in the Gulf and the Red Sea if a US naval blockade continues. That sentence sounds like rhetoric. It sounds like the kind of warning that gets issued, quoted, and forgotten. But in maritime geopolitics, words like shipping won't be safe are not just messaging. They are a switch. And once that switch flips, the risk isn't only that a ship gets hit. The risk is that enough ships believe they might get hit, and global trade starts acting like the threat is already real. Here's what you need to understand. The Gulf and the Red Sea are not separate arenas. They're connected parts of the same bloodstream. The Persian Gulf feeds into the Strait of Hormuz. The Red Sea feeds into the Bab el-Mandeb and up toward the Suez route. These are not nice-to-have waterways. These are narrow corridors that concentrate the world's energy and cargo into predictable lanes. Predictable lanes are efficient in peacetime. In a crisis, predictable lanes are targets. A naval blockade doesn't have to look like a wall of ships stopping every vessel. In modern conflicts, it can be partial, selective, informal, or framed as inspection, interdiction, security screening, or enforcement. It can be a policy enforced by presence, and presence enforced by the implication of force. The practical effect is what matters. If ships slow down, reroute, or turn back, then the blockade is already doing its job, whether it is officially declared or not. And that's why this warning matters now. Because Iran's threat, as reported, isn't aimed at a tank or a base or even a single warship. It's aimed at the system. It's aimed at the idea that the US and its partners can tighten control of waterways without paying a price. Iran's message is simple. If you make our access harder, we can make everyone's access harder. People will argue about whose move came first, whose justification is stronger, and what the legal definition of a blockade is under international law. Those debates will fill panels and headlines. But ships don't sail on debates. They sail on risk calculations. And when commanders start publicly connecting a US blockade to threatened commercial shipping in multiple seas, they are trying to change those calculations immediately before a shot is fired. Because changing behavior is often more powerful than sinking a ship. So the real story here is not Iran threatens. The real story is the creation of a countdown environment, a tightening blockade on one side and a widening threat envelope on the other. That combination compresses decision-making. It forces responses. And it raises the probability that a single incident, an interception, a drone sighting, a misread radar track, becomes the spark that nobody can walk back. Let me walk you through how threats to shipping actually work, because most people imagine one dramatic event, a ship stopped, boarded, or struck. That can happen. But the more decisive weapon is often fear made operational, risk turned into policy. A credible threat doesn't need to hit every ship. It needs to hit the confidence that keeps ships moving. Start with geography. The Persian Gulf is a confined body of water with heavy traffic and limited exit routes. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most strategically important choke points on Earth. Widely cited estimates suggest roughly a fifth of globally traded oil transits, that corridor in normal conditions. That's not a talking point. That's a structural dependency. In the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb is another narrow gate, linking the Indian Ocean routes with the Suez pathway. Disrupt either gate, and you don't just slow down a region, you create detours that burn time, fuel, money, and political patience. Now add modern capabilities. Threatening shipping doesn't require a blue water navy that can defeat the US fleet ship for ship. It requires a menu of tools that exploit the reality that commercial vessels are big, slow, and predictable, and that even major navies cannot be everywhere at once. Depending on the actor in the area, those tools can include anti-ship missiles from shore, drones, sea mines, small fast craft for harassment, boarding operations, and even cyber disruption aimed at navigation signals or port logistics. The point isn't to win the sea in the classic sense. The point is to make the sea too expensive to use normally. This is why blockade and threat to shipping are two sides of the same coin. A blockade tries to control movement. A counter-threat tries to make control costly. If the US tightens inspection regimes or limits access, Iran can respond by signaling that any tightening will expand the risk zone, turning a controlled blockade into an uncontrollable insurance crisis. And that insurance layer is where the real leverage lives. Maritime shipping relies on a web of insurers, underwriters, port authorities, flag states, and corporate risk committees. When threat perception rises, premiums rise. When premiums rise, routes change. When routes change, delivery times slip and prices jump. None of that requires a sustained naval campaign. It requires enough credible incidents, or enough credible statements backed by past incidents, to convince the private sector to self-restrict. In other words, the fastest way to blockade a waterway in the 21st century is sometimes not a fleet, it's uncertainty. Is it safe? Becomes, we can't guarantee it. And we can't guarantee it becomes we won't sail. Now consider escalation dynamics. A U.S. blockade posture, formal or informal, typically aims to apply pressure while minimizing open conflict. The goal is controlled friction. Stop certain flows, interdict certain items, deter certain movements, and keep the rest of the system stable. Iran's countermessage, as reflected in the headline, aims to break that control by expanding the consequences beyond the immediate target set. If you restrict us in one corridor, we will inject risk into multiple corridors. That's why this Gulf and Red Sea linkage is so important. It implies a strategic intent to broaden the playing field. It tells shippers, insurers, and foreign governments, you may not be a party to this, but you will pay if it continues. That is how regional crises become international crises, not through ideology, but through invoices. There's another layer here that competitors like your reference channel often push hard, the hidden mechanism angle. The hidden mechanism in shipping crises is not secret weapons. It's time. Chokepoints work because the system is optimized for speed and predictability. When predictability breaks, the backlog doesn't rise linearly, it compounds. A few days of disruption can take weeks to unwind. Containers miss connections. Refineries adjust feedstock. Retailers face gaps. Governments face voters. And in that environment, a commander's threat is not just a threat. It's an attempt to start the compounding now while negotiations and posturing are still underway. So when you hear Iran warns shipping in the Gulf and Red Sea, don't translate it into Iran might do something later. Translate it into what it's designed to do today. Raise the risk premium, shake confidence, and force everyone watching these waterways to ask a single question: how much disruption can we absorb before we have to change policy? Now let's talk about why this threat is being made in this form and why it's being paired explicitly with the continuation of a U.S. naval blockade. Because that tells you what Iran wants. It wants to define the terms of escalation so that every additional day of blockade increases the cost, not just for Iran, but for everyone. This is classic coercive signaling. The U.S. uses naval control to shape behavior, restrict movement, deter shipments, enforce red lines. Iran uses asymmetric maritime risk to shape behavior, make enforcement politically and economically expensive. Neither side has to announce war for the pressure to feel like war. And the Gulf Red Sea dual threat is strategic because it targets the psychology of coalition management. A blockade posture often relies on partners, regional states, European shipping interests, Asian energy importers, either actively supporting or at least not opposing. Iran's move is meant to test that coalition, because if shipping costs surge, some partners will privately push for restraint, carve-outs, or quiet compromises. That's not a military win, that's a political win. The U.S. side, meanwhile, faces its own dilemma. If it tightens a blockade and Iran's threats cause shipping disruption, Washington must decide whether to de-escalate, double down, or shift tactics. De-escalate, and you risk looking vulnerable to coercion. Double down, and you risk accelerating disruption and triggering incidents at sea. Shift tactics, and you risk losing the clarity of your original pressure campaign. This is the point where audiences usually ask, so what happens next? And the honest answer is, we're looking at an escalation ladder with 3 broad rungs, and the next move depends on whether leaders prioritize control, credibility, or economic stability. First rung, continued signaling with limited incidents. This is where rhetoric intensifies, patrols increase, advisories rise, and there may be isolated confrontations, shadowing, warnings, detentions, kept below the threshold that forces a major response. In this rung, both sides are trying to win without triggering a full cascade. Second rung, sustained disruption. Here the objective becomes not a headline incident, but persistent friction. Enough risk that shipping slows, reroutes expand, and costs rise. This is where the economic weapon becomes continuous. If this happens, you'll see normalization of danger, where markets stop reacting to every warning, but accept a permanently higher premium. That is devastating long term because it taxes every shipment, every day. Third rung, a catalytic event. This could be a serious strike, a major interdiction, or a miscalculation, something that forces leaders to respond quickly and publicly. Once that happens, you typically see rapid widening, escorts, expanded exclusion zones, more aggressive rules of engagement, and higher chances of accidental escalation. Notice what's missing from these rungs: a neat off-ramp. Off-ramps exist, but they're not clean. They usually involve quiet understandings, partial rollbacks, face-saving language, and temporary arrangements that can unravel. That's why, if the blockade continues, is such a sharp phrase. It makes the threat conditional, which implies a possible deal. Stop tightening and risk decreases. Continue tightening and risk spreads. Now connect this to the war and money layer your competitor loves. If shipping is threatened in both the Gulf and the Red Sea, you're threatening both energy routes and major container routes at the same time. That's how you get the kind of economic pressure that forces emergency meetings, even among countries that want to stay neutral. And here's the part the public often misses. Maritime escalation is rarely symmetrical. A single cheap action can impose a massive cost. A drone sighting can divert dozens of vessels. A mine scare can freeze a corridor. A threat can spike premiums. That asymmetry is why commanders make these statements publicly. The words are part of the weapon system. So, if you're trying to read this moment correctly, don't only watch military assets. Watch commercial behavior. Watch whether shipping companies pause, whether rerouting increases, whether port congestion shifts, whether energy prices move on fear rather than fundamentals. Those reactions are the scoreboard of maritime coercion. Here's what you should watch in the next 24 to 72 hours to know whether this is heading towards stabilization or escalation. Because in maritime standoffs, the indicators show up before the official announcements. Watch routing first. If ships begin to bunch up in safer holding patterns, if detours increase, if traffic density drops through choke points, that tells you risk perception is rising. And risk perception rising is the early stage of real disruption. Watch insurance chatter and advisory language next, not because it's flashy, but because it's where fear becomes policy. When underwriters and maritime security advisories shift tone, shipping changes course. Watch military posture changes that are visible. Increases in escort patterns, additional patrol aircraft, more publicized inspections, expanded warning zones. You don't need secret intelligence to see the direction of travel. You need to watch whether the operational footprint is growing and whether public messaging becomes more absolute. When statements move from conditional language to will language, when they stop saying if and start saying when, that's a signal that leaders are preparing audiences for confrontation. Watch the diplomatic layer for something very specific, not talks, but mechanisms, hotlines, deconfliction statements, third-party mediation language. Even small signals, like carefully worded acknowledgments that communication channels are open, can indicate that both sides fear accidents at sea and want to prevent an uncontrolled incident. Conversely, if you see public humiliations, maximalist demands, or repeated emphasis on no compromise, that's the opposite. That's leaders locking themselves into positions that make backing down harder. Now let me give you the core logic tying the whole story together. A blockade is a tool designed to apply pressure while keeping control. A threat to shipping is a tool designed to break that control by making pressure expensive. When an Iranian commander threatens Gulf and Red Sea shipping specifically because a U.S. blockade continues, the message is, you can't turn this into a contained enforcement action. If you keep tightening, the price won't be paid only by us. That's why this isn't just a regional warning. It's a global leverage play. It's aimed at everyone who relies on these lanes, everyone who insures these lanes, and everyone who wants this conflict to remain manageable. Because the moment shipping feels unsafe in more than one corridor, the world's ability to ignore the crisis collapses. And that brings us to the final question, the one that matters more than any press quote. Is the blockade designed to force a deal quickly, or to impose long-term containment? And is Iran's threat designed to deter or to disrupt? If both sides are playing long-term games, the risk is not a single dramatic night. The risk is a prolonged period where the sea becomes a bargaining table, and every ship becomes a signal. This is what I want you to remember. You don't need a declared war for the economy to behave like war is coming. You only need enough uncertainty that ships stop moving normally. If this blockade tightens and the threat to shipping becomes credible in the Gulf and the Red Sea at the same time, the pressure won't just build, it will spread. Subscribe for daily briefings that connect the statements you hear to the systems that actually move the world, shipping lanes, choke points, deterrence, and the financial shockwaves that follow. Because when commanders start talking about the sea, the next phase of the conflict is rarely on land. It's in the arteries that keep everything else alive.